All right, everyone, we've got another episode today. We've got Dr. Lemke here. Dr. Anna, the thing that I loved about you is you were the go-to knowledge reference in the documentary that most of the audience has seen, the social dilemma. You've authored a New York Times best-selling book that I quite enjoyed, called Dopamine Nation. I think it's a very interesting topic for everyone listening here. Stanford professor, excuse me. And if I'm not mistaken, you're the chief of addiction medicine at Stanford. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, it's amazing. I know you talk so much about addiction, and I think traditionally speaking, the audience or myself, when I think of addiction, I think of drug as hard street drugs as addiction, or alcohol. You talk about, obviously, in your book, and I want to talk to you today as if someone's never read the book, and some of the topics about the addiction regarding to dopamine, specifically a lot with social media and going on in our world. And I'd love for you to even just give a 10,000 foot blanket, hello on that topic, and we can dive into some just a natural conversation. I'm super excited again.
Sure. Happy to do that. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. So what is it about social media that makes it potentially addictive? I think it's first important to recognize that making human connections is healthy and adaptive, that we've evolved over millions of years to make those connections so as to optimize our survival. So, for example, to steward scarce resources, to find a mate, to protect ourselves from invaders. We're all much better off in a group than by ourselves. And one of the ways that our brains gets us to make these human connections is to release a little bit of dopamine, our reward neurotransmitter, in a specialized part of our brain called the reward circuit, when we make a human connection. So I think that's an important sort of groundwork for this, yes. That human connection is good, and it also feels good. And the reason it feels good is it because it releases dopamine, which is our rewarding neurotransmitter.
Yes.
So then what happens with social media? Where obviously social media is this really incredible modern way to connect in cyberspace with people near and far. And goodness, so many wonderful things about it. The problem is that the medium itself is highly reinforcing. So the screens themselves are reinforcing. They're like a primitive day fire that we're drawn to. They probably in and of themselves release some degree of dopamine. The connections that we make online can be true and real and good, but they also can be potent and reinforcing in ways that are not really true and real and good, but are really about releasing dopamine. Yes. And what does dopamine respond to? Dopamine responds to flashing lights, bright colors, beautiful faces, wonderful music, interesting narratives, enumeration, novelty. So all of these things are things that release dopamine, release more dopamine. And the bottom line is, at the end of the day, social media has essentially drugified human interaction, such that we can find ourselves swiping and clicking, not because we're making real human and intimate connections, but because we are in what's called limbic brain or lizard brain. This is the deep, highly evolutionarily conserved reward pathways of the brain that are driven almost exclusively by feeling and emotions. Emotions and feelings are good, but when emotions and feelings hijack the rest of the brain, not so good. And that's essentially, the danger. Plus, you have this artificial intelligence that's learning what we like and then chasing us down with more of what we like. Yes. And of course, it's very then hard to get away from it, even when we want to.
Yeah, I know for, myself, sometimes I'll even, and I rarely consume on social media, although, and I don't know if you know this about me, my entire business is social media marketing, is actually running advertisements. So that's why I thought this was
I didn't know that.
Yes, but it's exciting because it's a particularly awesome conversation for me to have and for my audience, because a high percentage of my audience, I'm sure, are on the internet, and they run internet ads, whether it's for products or services or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And to hear, contrarian is not the right word, but to hear the scientific conversation around why some of the things online are so effective, I think is extremely exciting for myself and the audience to hear and learn.
Hopefully you'll put the knowledge to good use.
Yes, and that's my intent with our conversation today. Is I'd love by the end of this to educate people first off on the dangers of what we're doing and how we're doing it, and then I'd love your opinion on how that good use is maybe we even start there. I'm actually curious when you say put it to good use. I'm curious in your definition. What does that look like?
Well, I really see this problem of the drugification of everyday life and our increased vulnerability to addiction across the board because the world has become addictogenic. Yes. As akin to climate change. It's a problem of the Anthropocene. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term, the Anthropocene, but it's a way to describe the unprecedented era in human and scientific history that we find ourselves in now, which is the era in which human action has changed the face of the planet. Climate change is usually the quintessential example of the Anthropocene, but I really do feel that A Dopamine Nation and the ideas in it and in other books, I'm talking about similar ideas, is the other important face of the Anthropocene that technology has allowed us to not just supersede mere survival, but actually make things so easy and accessible and reinforcing that our primary human challenge in modernity has become actually avoiding consuming rather than finding out what we can consume. So when I say, put it to good use, this is both an individual problem and a communal problem, which means that the interventions have to come from us as individuals and ways that we change our thoughts and behaviors as individuals, but also from top down, from corporations, from people like yourselves who work in this business, from schools, from the federal government. Just like climate change is not going to be alleviated by me not using plastic bags alone, right? It has to be a larger project. So, I don't know specifically your business and what kind of decision-making power you have, but what's very clear to me is that we need to make changes at the individual level, but we need top down to help us make those changes. So we cannot expect individuals in and of themselves to be able to curb this consumption. There has to be a way in which they have tools to help them do that.
Does that start with, in your opinion, government regulation around these platforms?
Probably doesn't start there.
Or not start, sorry. Is that in an ideal world? Is that what it looks like? Or
so I'm not going to pretend like I have the answers because I don't. But, we live obviously in a capitalist society that functions very well because of capitalism. Yep. So I actually think the first way to tinker with this is through monetary incentives and disincentives. If you look at something like cigarettes as kind of an example, so cigarette smoking in the United States has vastly decreased in the last 30 to 50 years. Right. How did it happen? Well, part of it was education, like educating people that cigarettes cause cancer, which is something that people didn't used to believe and that the corporations that make cigarettes originally fought against. But eventually, the science was just simply overwhelming. Cigarettes cause cancer. So that helped. But what really made a difference was actually when we started to tax cigarettes, because it turns out that even people who are severely addicted are price sensitive. And if they have to pay for their drug, they will use less or they will start using another drug. So I think that's really key. The other thing with cigarettes that helped is things like regulations, like not advertising cigarettes to minors, not allowing minors to buy cigarettes. And that's something that we're seeing, for example, in China. They've just put a moratorium on minors playing video games. Now in China, if you're under the age of 18, you can only play 2 days a week, 2 hours a day. Enforcing that's going to be difficult. And they're holding the corporations who make video games actually accountable for some of that enforcement, which is an interesting way to go. You can only do that in China, of course, or maybe Russia. Kind of big, scary governments. Of course. But what will work here, I don't know. In Great Britain, they've just passed a law that pornography sites cannot be accessed by minors. How on earth that will be enforced, I don't know. But those are the types of ideas.
It's very interesting. I was in Dubai literally last week, and cigarettes are taxed 100%. And then alcohol is taxed 50%. And you saw in a culture, I'd go into nightclubs and people aren't drinking.
Mhm.
Which was very interesting. So when you say again too, I do own my business. I have, relatively speaking, good decision-making power. And, when you speak about, capitalism, I think that's a really awesome, realistic comment that I agree. Cause, I'm like, hey, the government regulated, like in theory, cool. But, that being able to tax it, like you mentioned, and yeah, it'd be very interesting with social media being a free product. As we know,
Right.
it's not free. We are the product, but
Right.
being a free product, how you go around that, and very interesting, very interesting. I appreciate
Yeah.
your input on that.
And then when it comes, I recently listened to a colleague who specifically studies advertising talk about this phenomenon, and how really the reason that the platforms are created to keep us engaged is because the longer we're engaged, the more likely we are to interact with the ads.
Yes.
So if there were regulations on advertising, that could potentially mean that the makers of these products would be willing to make them less engaging, maybe.
Yes.
I don't know.
Sure.
Or make them engaging in a different way, or make them engaging with limits. So that's another idea that I've heard.
Interesting.
I guess I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, it's a you're right. It gets back to that enforceability, because even, and then the incentives, right? So Facebook will bring out, certain things. You can't say you can get better, teeth by this being whitened. You have to say, I got, like there's certain things that they put in place, but a lot of it feels, and this is talking from an advertiser, a lot of it feels like it's printed nicely in Congress to say, hey, we took these steps, and then are they actually how fully it's carried out? And we spend millions of dollars a month. So I'm not, someone spending a couple thousand, like just to see at that scale, they say one thing and kind of do another in a lot of ways. So it is interesting, because a lot of those are imposed on us, but they're not enforced to be imposed, if that makes sense.
Right.
So
Got it.
So it is interesting to your point, because theoretically, yeah, there's a way to hold me accountable to do my job in a societal beneficial way, we'll say, then you think, yeah, it starts with the advertisers. But ultimately, I completely agree that the platforms themselves are the ones, similar to the video games in China. I don't know if the video game companies are the ones that I think are that have to change from this, like, oh, we're taking these steps, to they're actually enforcing these steps and actually held further accountable, other than what I think sounds good on paper that they're doing. So yeah, so I'm specifically thinking about, when you're not able to target certain ethnicities or certain genders or stuff like that, right? They say like, okay, you can't, but there's roundabout ways to still target a African American in a low socioeconomical state. Even though I can't click a few buttons to get to that person, I can indirectly be able to find that person by their interests and likes. So it is interesting. Your comments there, I appreciate them, and I ultimately agree with them. Very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sure you talk about the lizard brain, and I've got friends that I've seen, or my little brother, or even me. I'll take accountability. Sometimes all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, I was just scrolling on Instagram for 45 minutes. What the, it's like literally, like, you turn, like I blacked out, right? Like,
yeah, no, it is like that. That's right.
And I think you started touching on it. Could you go any deeper you feel comfortable on the science on that? And then more importantly, how we can build that. You talked about the accountability at the individual level, how we can start building we'll call it, I don't know if a fortress around our mind, but some defensibility around this technology that you mentioned can be used for beautiful things, but also is very dangerous, just like any tool that's that powerful. But curious the science around it, and then defensibility steps you recommend people to start taking to not have the, oh my God, I just blacked out for an hour on Instagram.
Yeah. Well, in order to understand what's happening in the brain when we find ourselves engaged in this way that loses time, and that's more than we want and more than we planned, and compulsive, and we keep doing again and again, is to understand that one of the overriding rules governing our brain is that it wants to restore homeostasis or equilibrium. And I use an extended metaphor of the balance, of pleasure, pain, balance, in my book, Dopamine Nation, to describe this. But essentially, anything that's pleasurable will release dopamine. The more pleasure, the faster and more dopamine it releases. But our brains will immediately try to compensate for that increased dopamine by downregulating our dopamine production and transmission, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. So we go into this dopamine deficit state before we go back to equilibrium. And that's essentially what happens when once we're engaged and we're firing dopamine, in our limbic brain, our reward pathway, we have difficulty extricating ourselves, not because it's enjoyable in and of itself anymore, but because we've entered this dopamine deficit state. And now we're trying to make up for that by continually engaging in ever more potent, in ever greater quantities.
Is it like a drug addict getting more and more addicted to cocaine, where they need more and more to reach that same high? Is that a fair?
Yeah, it's like that, because really it's the same motivational machinery that gets hijacked in addiction, that we're all experiencing these mini hijackings when we're on the internet. And I think the key piece here is that dopamine deficit state, if we continue to consume these highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, eventually our downregulation of dopamine gets to be semi-permanent, where then now we're walking around in this dopamine deficit state, which is akin to clinical depression. And now we're using more and more, not even to feel good, but just to stop feeling bad. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about entering this addiction phase. But even in that moment of like, putting the Instagram down, there is this feeling of falling away, and it's a painful feeling. And that's that dopamine deficit state, which is how our brain keeps us physiologically compelled to want to keep engaging. It wants to bring it back, bring those levels back up again. Now, if we abstain from our drug for long enough for our body to start making those dopamine levels again, then it's fine. But in that moment of that come down, it's very hard to resist the physiologic urge to keep going in order to avoid the come down.
Yeah. And you talk about in your book, or I believe I saw an interview with you and Dr. Huberman, talk about a detox.
Right.
Could you touch on that, or even before the detox? Let's say that that painful moment of putting it down. Is there anything more than just you have to fight through that pain and experience that pain because you've built up so much pleasure, or you depleted your dopamine so much? Like, is there anything, like right now, someone who's addicted, I shouldn't even use quotes, addicted to social media, how does one start to unwind that addiction to get that equilibrium back to healthy levels?
Right. Well, I think the first thing to do is to just, understand the neuroscience and be honest with ourselves about what is that behavior that we're over consuming in a way that's compulsive and contrary to our goals and values. Yeah. Because what happens is we can lead this kind of double life, and it can be sort of outside of our awareness. We can rationalize and minimize. But if we actually sit down and say, I'm actually spending this much time every day doing this activity, that is not something I want to continue in the future, just actually articulating it to ourselves or another human being, especially to another human being, can be really useful. And then saying to ourselves, well, why do I do it? What's the upside for me? Usually it's an escape, it's a reward, it's a way to not think, it's a kind of a numbing. It's in that sense a pleasure, but really what people, in my experience, are mostly looking for is just to not be for a while. They just want to escape. And that's a very kind of, I think, a sort of a natural human urge. And we've lost the art of finding more adaptive ways to do that. Now we rely on our phones and this digital content for that. And then to think to ourselves and be honest about, well, what are the problems associated with that? And often there's subtle problems, like there's subtle relationship problems or subtle health problems. Where instead of exercising, we're scrolling, subtle sleep problems, or even the fact that this dopamine deficit state is akin to clinical depression. So we're not able to enjoy other more modest rewards, and we need more of our drug over time to get the same effect. That's also a problem, right?
Yeah.
And then that gets us to the dopamine fast or the abstinence challenge, where we then set a quit date and plan to abstain from our drug of choice for long enough to reset reward pathways. And in my experience, that usually takes about a month. Yeah. If you do less than that, then you're still going to be in this state of semi-withdrawal, and you're never going to get to a place where you're really feeling better. So I usually prescribe a month of deleting that app, or not going on that YouTube channel, or, not playing that video game, or not looking at that pornography website or that shopping website or whatever it is. And it's pretty painful to do. Those first 2 weeks are pretty awful. The universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. But if you can just get through the first 2 weeks, usually people feel like the sun comes out in weeks 3 and 4. And not only are they sort of less depressed and anxious, but also really able to enjoy other more modest rewards, and also able to look back and see true cause and effect. It's very hard when you're in it to be able to really see what's happening. So that's essentially the initial recommendation. I talk about self-binding strategies, and these are kinds of barriers that we can put between ourselves and our drug of choice in order to help extend our willpower. And it's things like actually deleting the app, not just saying I'm not going to do it, or maybe even actually, putting the phone away for a certain period of time. Andrew Huberman, he loves grayscale. For him, that was huge, changing it to grayscale so the images weren't so potent. Turning off alerts, that's really key, because alerts or reminders themselves release a little dopamine in the reward pathway, followed by a little dopamine deficit state, which then drives the physiologic urge to want to get the drug. So if you're constantly stimulating your brain with your reminders, you're basically putting your brain into craving.
Yeah.
So you want to turn off all the alerts, you want to create those kinds of spaces. Sometimes for people, it also means maybe their drug of choice is a certain video game, but they also find they can't watch YouTube of people playing video games because that's too much of a trigger. So the 30-day abstinence fast has to be not just the video game that they're addicted to, but all of the reminders around the video game.
It's interesting. First off, that introspection is huge. Just, I guess, in any category in life, just to be able to take that time and analyze what actions am I taking, what are the results that I'm getting, and do they align with what I want? And defining what I want is beautiful. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for also sharing the specific tactics and tips to actually get in place and not theoretically just say, do less of it. Say 30 days, delete the apps. Set grayscale, like Dr. Huberman talks about, removing the brightness, so the notifications as well too. So for myself, I removed all notifications from my phone. I still get phone calls, but everything else I don't get notifications. I don't have necessarily, in my opinion, a issue on consuming on social media apps, but my addiction is my email and my Slacks for my business. I'll catch myself just clicking refresh. And as you were talking, I was like, okay, first I had this false sense that, this doesn't apply to me. I don't have that on social media. And then as you're talking, I'm like, but you do have that elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And then as you're talking, well, I could very easily delete the email app for my phone and just have it on my desktop, you know what I mean? Or my computer, right? Which isn't with me when I'm going to the literally I'll catch myself going to the bathroom and I'm just there and I'm just refreshing and I just refreshed 40 seconds ago and I'm like, what is going on? You know what I mean? And so it's funny as you were talking, thank you, because you unlocked that for me right after this call. I'm gonna delete the Slack and email app on my phone to actually start taking those steps, because that is my addiction.
Yeah, that's a great self-binding strategy. And it really points out one of the major problems, which is that the smartphone itself has become the equivalent of the hypodermic syringe. It delivers this portable 24/7 hits of dopamine, and quantity and frequency really matter. The more that we're pinging our brains, the more likely we are to get into this addicted brain. So by limiting our access to these, things like email, which is sort of the quintessential addiction of the modern day workaholic, by limiting our engagement with email to a specific, less portable device, that is a great self-minding strategy. And in fact, that's one that I have always engaged. I have a smartphone now, but I keep it literally turned off and in my bag, and I only use it to communicate outward for emergency purposes or while I travel, or to engage with my refill system. So that means that I've consolidated my email correspondence to just my computer, which is, not this kind of thing that you take out while you're running for the bus.
For sure.
So, and I think that can be really helpful. I still think it needs to start with a bit of a dopamine fast. So it's really hard when people with businesses and they feel like they have to be on top of it. But, there is this thing called a vacation, and I recommend it be tech-free, where either for a week, if you can't do it a month, that's unrealistic, at least for a week or maybe even a weekend.
Yep.
Really just have no tech in your life, and watch how, you go through withdrawal and FOMO and all of it, how our brain will make up these rationalizations for why it's absolutely life critical for us to, go back online, when actually it's not. Nobody's really dispensable. There's somebody who can cover it for you.
Yes.
And then when you come back on Monday and you re-engage with these self-binding strategies, the one you just talked about, limiting it to less portable devices. Also, chronology or time is a really nice self-binding strategy. So limiting, that before you go on your computer, make a to-do list of what you're actually going to do on the computer. Limit the number of hours to like 9 to 5 business hours, or just a certain number of hours per day. So use time as a way to kind of limit or focus. And this is really, really challenging because, again, the medium itself is reinforcing, right? The way that we get something in our inbox, or even if it's not a source of joy for us to get something in our inbox, if we're just compulsive about wanting to get it out of our inbox, right? And we just keep trying to chase it down so that we have fewer things in our inbox, that's its own little form of addiction. So just recognizing it will never be over, we'll never get the work. It's like Sisyphus. It never ends. So at least limit pushing your rock up the hill to certain discrete times of the day and try to leave it behind.
That's great. And I want to talk about something semi-gloomy, but could you touch on, because I know even like listening, I was like, oh, this isn't me, or I don't have that big a problem. Could you touch on, like, from a like a body standpoint, neurological chemistry, the biggest issue with not taking the steps that we're talking about? What is the end? What does that lead to? Like we have it, like, I have this picture, like someone does too much drugs, it leads to meth leads to fate and death, right? And I'm like, oh my God, like I've never touched a drug in my life, or at least like a substance, right? Like a street, anything like that. For that reason, probably just because I saw, like, wow, this path you can go down. I'm not sure, at least for myself, I'll willing to speak for the audience, I have a clear path of, like, where does this go if I keep going down this path? Could you touch on that? Like, at a worst case, like, what does this lead to when we're so addicted to these dopamine hits that social media creates, or technology? We've been just blanking on that. Could you touch on, like, where that leads to in, like, a really worst case scenario?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. So, I mean, if we continue to bombard our dopamine pathway with highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, this fire hose of dopamine is not something that our brains were evolved to handle. We evolved this system in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, where we had to walk tens of kilometers just to get a drink of water. So what does our brain do as it reels in response? It vastly downregulates our own feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters. It stops, making dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, endogenous cannabinoids, endogenous opioids. It says, wait a minute, I got to put all that stuff down in the basement. And the result is that we essentially end up depressed, anxious, unable to sleep, unable to concentrate. A kind of great lassitude overwhelms us, where we feel unable to really invest in any behavior that is not related to obtaining and using our drug. Our drug becomes the center and focus of our lives. Everything else falls away. And this is usually accompanied by a profound kind of despair, and can even, in some severe cases of addiction, lead people to want to end their lives. So, this is non-trivial. And some people will say, well, you can't really get addicted to a behavior that way. And I'll just say, well, I wish you could be a fly on the wall in my clinic. I have seen people depressed, anxious, and profoundly suicidal as a result of sex and pornography addiction and compulsive masturbation. And, it's the same natural history and physiology as we see when people get addicted to alcohol or cocaine or really any drug. So, I think I've seen the same thing with video games. I've seen similar things with social media. Workaholism is interesting because it's so rewarded in our society that it can be very difficult to even identify it as an addiction. But I think where that usually comes out is in a couple of ways, in relationships. So the costs to families and important relationships that get sacrificed to workaholism, but also many people with workaholism will develop addictions to other things because they're working so hard that they get into this play hard, work hard, play hard mentality, that they bookend their work days by rewarding themselves with these, highly reinforcing drugs, and then ultimately get addicted to those kinds of drugs.
Thank you for that. And your suggestion is, so someone's like severely in a path where they're addicted to technology, the 30-day fast. I guess let me formulate what I'm trying to ask. How quickly does the body respond to behavioral changes for the positive? So I'm at a low state or a low place right now where I'm highly addicted to technology. How quickly and through what actions, and you shared those, do you see a positive response to the body where it's, you mentioned serotonin levels, norepinephrine, and how quickly do you see those respond to positive behavioral changes?
Yeah. So after, 2 decades of practicing psychiatry and treating patients for these kinds of problems, what I have seen, and which also is consistent with some of the limited science that we have on this, is that it takes on average 30 days. And that if it's less than 30 days, the risk is that people go into this dopamine deficit state and experience the withdrawal without getting the rewards, and then don't see the connection between their drug use and how it's causing, these bad things. You really need to do the full 30 days to get to the place where you restore baseline reward pathways and dopamine firing and feel better. And short of that, people usually don't see it. Now, people who are younger, whose brains are more plastic, who are less addicted or less have had less exposure to the drug, could probably see benefits sooner. But in general, once we become sort of compulsively engaged with our drug of choice, in my experience, it takes a month.
That's and relatively speaking, that's not a long time.
Yeah, in our large life scans, it's not a lot, but actually doing it in practice is really tough.
Of course, yeah,
it's really tough. I would also just add that if you're physically dependent to a drug like alcohol or Xanax or other benzos, you don't want to do this on your own where you suddenly cut it out, because you could have a life-threatening withdrawal. You want to get help from a medical professional.
That's good to know. No, I appreciate you clarifying that. And you said something, I know we only have a few more minutes. You said it's a, and I don't want to misrepresent your words, but essentially that it's a human tendency to want to escape. And then you said that there are other, this is how I interpret it. It's not what you said, but more empowering ways to escape. Could you comment on my interpretation was like, it's okay that humans want to escape, or it's normal. And then there's more empowering ways. Could you touch on both of those points for me?
Yeah. So, I do think that it's normal. We live in a very narcissistic culture where we're preoccupied with the individual. We're encouraged to be preoccupied with ourselves. And I don't really think that's how we are happy or healthy. Really, what we want to do is merge. And is in that merging and that losing that individuation of the self that we really have our moments of grace and happiness, and that we're at greatest peace. And so it's very hard in a culture that encourages us to individuate and distinguish ourselves as separate from others to achieve this, or even be aware that it's worth achieving. But so deep human intimate connections with others are a healthy and adaptive source of dopamine and a good way to lose ourselves. The other healthy way, as long as it's not taken to extreme, is to actually do things that are physically challenging, which then is a form of hormesis, or a branch of science that has shown that by exposing ourselves to painful stimuli or mild to moderate noxious stimuli, we can actually upregulate. It's essentially, we're telling our bodies that the body's in danger and that the body needs to start making more dopamine and other feel-good neurotransmitters. So that's a way to lose ourselves. Of course, you can take that to an extreme too and get addicted to things like exercise. So you don't want it to be too much and too potent a form. Spiritual and religious pathways. So, human connection, connections to our bodies, connections to the divine. These are all, I think, healthier and adaptive ways to lose the self.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. This has been so enlightening on so many levels. Again, too, I fell prior to our combo to the fallacy of this doesn't apply to me because I'm not, and obviously I don't fully believe that, or I wouldn't have even reached out, but I'm not aimlessly scrolling on Instagram for hours a day like others are, but I am doing that on other mediums like we talked about. So this is extremely insightful for myself. I appreciate it. I know everyone listening is going to be insanely insightful for it. Is there anything else I can leave everyone with? If you haven't seen The Social Dilemma, it's it's an amazing documentary that really breaks into the science of what these social media companies are doing. Dopamine Nation is a beautiful book that just really, I enjoyed it for talking about addiction as a whole, but specifically in modern day society and some of the things we talked about today. You touched on from there. Is there anything I left out that you think would be good to share with, let's just say, 20 to a 40-year-old who is either a move fast salesperson, a business owner, or works online in some ways? Is there anything else you would say to them or could bestow upon them that'd be helpful outside of the dozens and dozens of nuggets that you gave us?
I think you did. I think you did a great job, covering some of the highlights.
Great. No, I appreciate it so much, and I appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, thank you for your work. And I'm looking forward to continuing to follow you.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for
Thanks,
having
Doc.
me.